morning. Today is June 27th, 2021. I am talking about George Fox as part of adult education for the monthly meeting of the Friends of Philadelphia. I have a timeline that I've been putting together to try and figure out where George Fox came from and what happened. George Fox lived himself from 1624 to 1691, which, if you know anything about history, was a pretty tumultuous time. However, I want to go back before that, before he was born in 1624, long before, 300 years, well, 250 years before that. John Wycliffe translated the Bible into English. So there was an English version of the Bible. Now that's very important to understand what happened, why George Fox was able to do what he did, why Martin Luther was able to do what he did. And there's a direct line back from George Fox through Martin Luther, Emperor Augustine, Jesus, if you follow the lines. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed 95 theses onto the church door in Wittenberg. Martin Luther was a priest, and he was also a lawyer, and he was very good at writing. And he was also an extraordinary orator. June 24th, 1517, Martin Luther went to Magdeburg and he preached. And it was such an incredible sermon that the whole town became Protestant overnight. I mean, I've just found that was the most extraordinary thing I'd ever heard, and I wanted to find out more. Well, in 1517, Christianity had been in Europe since about 400 AD. I'm not a historian, but I'm trying my hardest. So for at least 1,000 years, Christians had been running things from Rome and from Constantinople. And by 1517, a lot of people were really mad because the Roman Catholic Church sitting in Rome, they owned a lot of lands, Vatican lands, that they lost in the 1800s. The Vatican now we see as 1 square mile, but it certainly wasn't like that in 1517. And it wasn't like that when George Fox was alive. And it wasn't like that until about 1871, when Rome lost a lot of lands. But by 1517, they were pretty much organized. They had monasteries all over the place, priories. They were centers of education, centers for healthcare. And they were also extracting a whole lot of money from the people, but mostly the rulers, the princes, the archbishops, the priests. And by 1517, people were pretty mad at this. Germany did not exist until 1871. There were all these little kingdoms all over the place, and they were all Christian. So they were all giving money to Rome, which they didn't want to do. And so what happened then was all these people who immediately were converted to Protestantism, they suddenly realized they didn't have to pay money to Rome anymore. And they could keep everything they collected. They weren't against taxing. They loved taxing. They just wanted to keep the money themselves. So that's what happened. So Martin Luther was a heretic. He'd been saying that God does not come through the Pope anymore. And he said 2 important things. He said that the Bible is the most important thing with the Christian religion, and you should believe every word in the Bible. The second thing he said was that you are saved by faith and not by works. So the Roman Catholic Church was saying, you give money to the poor, you go to heaven. You give money to the priests, you go to heaven. And Martin Luther was saying, no, 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 no. Don't give money to the priests. Pray. So Martin Luther's life was pretty much threatened, except that everyone around him was decided that he was making sense. And one of the princes took him in and hid him so that he wouldn't get beheaded or whatever they did to heretics, that burnt them, whatever they did to heretics. So he took him in, and Martin Luther was essentially in prison. And like all founders of great movements, he wrote a book when he was in prison. Hitler did the same thing. So did George Fox. So he wrote a book, and then he got more and more people who were supporting him. And one by one, there were kingdoms around Europe were becoming Protestant, including Denmark, Sweden. And then finally, after a few years, it was less than 20 years, this whole movement moved to England, and Henry VIII decided that he could reclaim 1/3 of the properties in England by deciding to be Protestant and kicking out the Roman Catholic Church. So he started dissolving the monasteries in 1538, and he was excommunicated. And by 1542, all the Catholic properties were taken over by Henry VIII, and he died in 1549. Meanwhile, in 1536, the Tyndale Bible had been completed, translating the Bible from English and Greek texts into English. And so they executed Tyndale. Everyone seemed to be killing each other. By 1558, there was an act of supremacy which confirmed the independence of the Church of England from the Church in Rome. Now, Protestants had all been told that you could be saved by faith. So this actually is interesting. This is why you have so many different Protestant religions. Because it's like, okay, we can have our own faith. We don't have to do what the Pope says anymore. And so suddenly you have this sprouting of so many other different religions. You've got the Presbyterians, which were in Rome. You have a whole lot of other religions that I've never heard of. But Quakers came out of this too, because here you are, you were told you would be saved by faith. Now, this is all connected with human rights. In 1562, Sir John Hawkins, when Queen Elizabeth of England was Queen of England, Sir John Hawkins left Plymouth in order to traffic African humans, sailed to the Dominican Republic with 125. He had started out with 300. I mean, if that doesn't make you sad, I don't know what will. He was funded by Elizabeth I, and it was the start of the royal slave trade, which was kept on going well until the 18th century. So it was the triangle slave trade was absolutely sponsored by the kings and queens of England. I discovered I'm actually a direct descendant of Sir John Hawkins, which upsets me no end, but probably everyone else is too. I mean, you go back 500 years, there's like 100,000, 5 million ancestors. So that was in 1562. 1562 is when trafficking of Africans really got started. 1599, Oliver Cromwell was born. Now, Oliver Cromwell was very much part of George Fox's life. In 1614, a little girl was born and became Margaret Askew. Now, her importance is she grew up, and when she was 18, she married Judge Thomas Bell. Now, George Fox could not have done anything without the help of Margaret and Thomas Fell. Okay, so Margaret Fell was born in 1614. She married the Judge Thomas Fell in 1632. Meanwhile, in 1616, Isaac Pennington was born. Now, Isaac's father was the Lord Mayor of London, and he actually had all his property seized by Charles II for being part of the trial of Charles I. This was a very tumultuous century. Isaac Pennington's granddaughter married William Penn. So what I'm doing now is I'm telling you the very important, powerful, wealthy people that were involved in George Fox's rise. So we have Oliver Cromwell, who became the protector of England. We have Margaret Fell, who became his chief sponsor, and he even married her, which I find absolutely incredible. Isaac Pennington, whose father was, as I said, Lord Mayor of London, but he was also a member of Parliament. So here are all these people had all been born, and then in 1624, George Fox was born in Fenny Drayton. 8 years after George Fox was born, Margaret married Thomas Fell. 1643. Now this is, I want to tell you where I get all my information from. Three sources. One is stories people have told about George Fox, who were there. So they're like first-hand accounts. Secondly, George Fox's words himself, which is definitely a first-person account. And thirdly, people's opinions of George Fox. I have a lot of very nice books. Rufus Jones and Henry Cadbury were two Quaker theologians who wrote an enormous amount, and really they together founded the American Friends Service Committee when the President of the United States was a Quaker, which is how the American Friends Service Committee got started. The theme throughout this is, if you want to start a movement or an organization that works, hang on to someone who's very rich and very powerful. Rufus Jones and Henry Cadbury certainly understood that. Martin Luther certainly understood that. I mean, he wasn't messing around with regular people. He was messing around with kings and archbishops, incredibly wealthy people. He was not interested at all in ordinary people. He very happily genocided a whole bunch of people who wanted human rights forms, but that was never what Martin Luther wanted. Martin Luther just wanted a regime change. He was very happy with what was going on top, but he wanted a regime change. He didn't want a revolution. This is another nice book too, Friends in the Americas. I'm just showing you some of the books that I'm using. This is a book that I think everyone connected to Arch Street should read. Greg Barnes, who is a member of Central Philadelphia Meeting, Philadelphia's Arch Street Meeting House. And this is another nice one too, Quaker Spirituality, which is a whole group of essays. Most of these books came from Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Library, which really isn't a library. It's a collection of books on the balcony over an event space where they actually hold choir practices, which is an odd place for a library. This is very nice too. Esther Greenleaf Muir is a member of Central Philadelphia Meeting, and she put together this, and it was published by the Fellowship of Quakers in the Arts. And it's all about George Fox objecting to singing and dancing and all sorts of things. And I'll actually read you the first. George Fox in 1658. O ye poets, jesters, rhymers, makers of verses and ballads, who bend your wits to please novelties, light minds, who delights in jests and toys, more in the simple naked truth which you should be united to. You are for the undoing of many poor souls. It is your work to tickle up the ears of people with your jests and toys. This proceeds from a wrong heart where dwells the lust, and feeds the wrong heart and mind and wits, which brings them to the grave and dust, and there buries the minds and clogs the nature, which is a shame to all that be in the modesty and pure sincerity and truth and cleanness of mind. Wow. This is Martin Luther. That's my other book. Okay, but I was telling you how George Fox fits in all of this. So already, you know, he doesn't like music and dancing. And what else doesn't he like? He doesn't have a problem with slaves. He doesn't have a problem with slaves. And I think a lot of that is because the slave trade really wasn't in full swing when he was alive. It was just as horrific as you've heard. It was horrendous for everyone, but he may well not have understood it or known it. Although he did go to Jamaica, he did go to the Dominican Republic, but who knows who he talked to? I don't know. I have a lot of articles here. If anyone's interested in that, I found a very nice article that was written about George Fox and monthly meeting the Friends of Philadelphia, who very happily kept slaves. And anyway. It bothers me immensely. But what I found with everything I've read about George Fox is that he was a very flawed person. I mean, if you read his journal, which is on Gutenberg Press, and I've got that link too, you can read it for free. And you can also listen to it. There's a very nice recording that was made last year of George Fox's journal. Now, George Fox's journal, this is the thing. George Fox wrote an enormous amount. He wrote pamphlets, he wrote letters. He loved to write, and he was obviously very good at it. But his journal was heavily edited by others. I'm not sure who it was that edited it, but there was a lot of editing going on, and they took out all kinds of stuff. Like he's talking, like his charismatic stuff, his Pentecostal stuff, his healing. I found a video from a member of Haddonfield Meeting, Michelle Tarter, whom I've known for a long time. She's professor of English at Rutgers University, and she's a Quaker theologian. And she wrote about it, his healing ministry. Now, if you've spent time in Africa and African communities, as I have, you know that healing, touching people and they're healed, praying over and they're healed. I was once sued for $20 million by this woman who claims that her father rose from the dead after 3 days. And that isn't why she sued me. It was something else. But she's really good at lying, is what I'm saying. And the issue too of, and George Fox talks about that too, people who were dead and he just came to them and they lived. Well, they might not have been dead. I mean, this is the thing. And maybe they were lying, and maybe they leave out all the dead people that they didn't raise from the dead, and all the people they didn't, make sick. I mean, make well after being sick. My parents were both physicians, so I've never been anti-medicine. And in fact, when I was little in New Zealand, we lived in a hospital, and my PhD and all my research was in medical schools, and my colleagues were all physicians. I even married 2 physicians at one stage. So I'm not, I'm not anti-physician, which it seems like he was. And maybe it's because medicine was not terribly good during the 1600s. And why was it not terribly good? Because it had been very good. It had been very good under the monasteries. The monks and the priests, they built all these monasteries, they built these centers of teaching, they built these centers of healing. And suddenly along comes Martin Luther and decides, because he's, you know, he wants everything, he just wants to get rid of everything. So when they got rid of the taxes, they also got rid of healthcare and they got rid of education. So by the 1600s, George Fox is walking around. They're burning women who are trying to figure out ways that their plants can heal people. They're burning them as witches. So along comes George Fox, and he has a reputation as a healer. This is one huge reason he was so popular. Apart from the most important thing was that he was taken up by very wealthy and very powerful people. So let's get on to that then. The Civil War started in 1642. Now remember, he was born in 1624, so he was 18. In 1645, okay, so this is 3 years after the Civil War started, Judge Fell, who was a Puritan, a prominent Puritan, was elected to Parliament for the city of Lancaster. So Judge Fell wasn't just a judge, he was one of the rulers. Now, 1647, when he was 23, he started preaching and people started coming towards him. 1648, the Second World War starts. And 1648, Judge Fell, who was already a member of Parliament, was named a commissioner for the safety of the county by Oliver Cromwell. A year later, Charles I is beheaded in January. Now, in order to behead a king, I mean, this freaked everyone out because, you know, a king is ordained by God and there's holy oil and prayers and all kinds of things. And, you know, it's not, the humans aren't making him king, God is. So this really freaked people out. And only 5 people signed the death warrant. And when his son was restored to the monarchy, he killed everyone. Of course he did. Nasty times. So George Fox was imprisoned for the first time in 1649. Now remember, the Civil War is still going on. The Civil War was going on from 1648 to 1651. And during that time, Charles I was beheaded. And George kept getting imprisoned. He was imprisoned in Nottingham. He was imprisoned in Derby. Then in 1652, George Fox takes a walk through the countryside in Lancashire, which is where the Dodgsons came from. In fact, where he was like 5 miles from where my Dodgson name came from, which I find absolutely amazing. So a lot of Dodgsons were Quakers and still are. So he wanders up to Pendle Hill. Now, Pendle means hill, so a hill, it's a hill. And he sees all these people in white and he has a revelation. And it's, and something is quoted that you've probably all seen, that it's Jesus Christ is the condition. You've got to understand what Jesus was doing. I'm saying that very badly, but that's all in his book. In fact, why don't I find that for you? Because I'm looking through his book at the moment. Now, what's interesting too about the book is William Penn gave the preface. Anyway, I can't find it. But that was his revelation. And that is when the Religious Society of Friends is supposed to have started in 1652. Now, luckily, in 1652, this is when he met Margaret Fell. Now, what is interesting about this is he met Margaret Fell. When Judge Fell was racing off, you know, he was off somewhere, being a judge, being a commissioner, being a member of parliament. And George Fox somehow came across them. I'm not sure whether he just wandered into their house or what happened. But George Fox converted, whatever that means. Converted them all. And then Judge Fell came back and George Fox met him and he explained to him what he'd done, what he'd said and how great it was. And Judge Fell, who was definitely a very enlightened husband, he said, okay, you can all use my huge house, Swarthmore Hall, for friends to meet in. And he used to sit at the door when friends were meeting in I guess they had huge rooms, whatever huge room, in order to make it quite clear that he approved of what was going on. And his wife is quoted as saying he was very loving to friends. So 1652, later on, George Fox was arrested for blasphemy. I'm amazed it took so long, but I guess it took a while for people to realize what he was doing. He was released because one of the judges was Judge Fell. It really helps to know people in important places. Then 1653, he was arrested in Carlisle. Then he was arrested in Leicestershire. Now, in 1654, when he was arrested in Leicestershire, this is really fascinating. He was brought to London and he spent a whole morning hanging out with Oliver Cromwell, speaking truth to power. Wow. He had, whoever was prosecuting him wanted to have him executed, but somehow this went to Parliament and he wasn't, and the sentence of death was taken away. In 1655, George Fox published a pamphlet, and you can read this pamphlet. It's called A Warning to the World Groping After Sects, Opinions and Notions. So, and it's very nice. And the front page says, a warning to the world that are groping in the dark after sects, opinions and notions, which are all with the light condemned and by the children of light declared against. By G. Fox, London, printed for Giles Calvert at the Black Spread Eagle at the West End of Paul's, 1655. Them which the world, who are without the fear of God, calls Quakers in scorn, do deny all opinions, and they do deny all conceivings, and they do deny all sects, and they do deny all imaginations and notions and judgments, which riseth out of the will and the thoughts, and do deny witchcraft and all oaths and the world and the works of it, and their worships and their customs with the light, and do deny false ways and false worships, seducers and deceivers, which are now seen to be in the world with the light, and with it they are condemned, which light leadeth to peace and life from death, which now thousands do witness, the one teacher, Christ, him by whom the world was made, who reigns among the children of light, and with the spirit and power of the living God, doth let them see and know the chaff from the wheat, and doth see that which must be shaken, with that which cannot be shaken nor moved, which gives to see that which is shaken and moved, such as live in the notions, opinions, conceivings, and thoughts and fancies. These all be shaken, and comes to be on heaps, which they who witness those things before mentioned, shaken and removed, walks in peace, not seen and discerned by them, who walks in those things unremoved and not shaken. Okay, he goes on for quite a few more paragraphs, but you can see his main inspiration is Jesus. And that's what he sees that he's following. He's following the light. I'm not sure who first started talking about the light. I do know that George Fox seemed to have spent his youth and actually all his life walking around with Bibles. He was always, if you read his autobiography, you see he kept coming across people and trying to find out, trying to talk to them about religion, about Christianity, about faith, and they all let him down. So what he was doing, what he did, and he describes this a lot, is he just grabbed his Bible and he'd go off and find a hollow tree. Now, I left England a long time ago. I'm not sure why there are so many hollow trees in England, but it seems like that's what he liked to do. It's just a lovely image of this young man all just curled up in a hollow tree with the Bible. Yeah. In 1655, Isaac Pennington published a pamphlet. Now, I told you about Isaac Pennington earlier. His father was Lord Mayor of London, and his granddaughter married William Penn. So his father was Lord Mayor of London and had all his property seized by Charles II for the trial of Charles I. Okay, getting back to that, 1649, January 1649, Charles I is beheaded. Then you have, I suppose it's a republic, but it's Oliver Cromwell. This is very confusing to me, how this all happened. But around 1660, there was a restoration of the monarchy, and Charles II became king. And his wife was Catholic, and she wouldn't take part in the coronation because he was a Protestant. And then they kind of ran out of Protestants. So they had something called the Glorious Revolution in 1688. This is amazing. So this is all happening while George Fox is running around. He's traveling to America. He's preaching. He's writing everything. 1681, Charles II gave William Penn's father Pennsylvania and Delaware. 1682, William Penn lands in Pennsylvania. So, but the Glorious Revolution in 1688 was suddenly the king that was going to be next was Catholic. So there was a revolution when the people of England removed the King of England again, and William of Orange somehow or other just sort of happened to wander into London and became the King of England. Very interesting. And then 1689, the Bill of Rights was written in England, which includes the freedom of speech, rights to the petitioned king, and not be prosecuted for it. So a lot of, everything was happening then. And I didn't even get to something incredible. 1666 was the Great Plague of London, which ended up killing 100,000 people, 25% of the population of London. So here they've had this, they've chopped the head off the king, they've had 2 civil wars, they've had the restoration of the monarchy, the Royal Africa Company was set up to have a monopoly of trafficking in humans from Africa, given to the royal families. 1663, Royal Africa Company Charter included exclusive and legal trafficking of African humans to Europe and the Americas. And that's when everything really started. Now remember, George Fox was born in 1624. So he was already over 40. He was already wandering around. He already had his chat with Oliver Cromwell and was hanging out with the Fells. And when all this started happening, it may well be that so much was happening was that he just wasn't paying attention. I cannot believe that he would not be opposed to slavery. given everything I've read about him. He was clearly a very compassionate person. I mean, people would come to him and they would just fall in love with him. Look what happened to Margaret Fell. She just adored him and she ended up marrying him. So that's that. So anyway, Great Plague of London, 1665, 1666. In 1666, Margaret Fell published a pamphlet about why women should be able to speak. And this was like the beginning of the importance of women in the Society of Friends. Oh, as an aside, why is it called the Society of Friends? I had thought it was because, you know, we're all friends and we all love each other, but apparently that's not what it was at all. It's Friends of Truth. That's where the friends came from. We're friends of truth. How about that? So you're allowed to not like people. That's, I think, what that means. So in 1658, Judge Fell had died. And it wasn't for another 11 years, 1669, when George Fox married Mrs. Margaret Fell. Right away, she was imprisoned in Lancaster for 18 months, and George became ill. 1669, William Penn was imprisoned for being a Quaker. And he did what all good people do when they're in prison. He wrote a book, and he wrote, No Cross, No Crown. Now, remember, 1669, William Penn's in prison. He didn't get to the Americas until 1681. So he had 12 years of hanging out in Britain before he ended up in the Americas. This is all very confusing, though. Charles II gave William Penn's father Pennsylvania and Delaware, but before that, he'd taken things away because of some support for the wrong people. So it's like everything was like giving and taking and giving and taking. It's a very strange time. Now, 1669, Margaret Fell has married George Fox. She's in prison. He becomes ill. As soon as he recovers, he's on a 7-week trip to Barbados. So he goes to Barbados. He goes to the Dominican Republic. And when he's in, I believe, the Dominican Republic, he writes a letter that is supposed to be about his view on slavery. And because he doesn't condemn it, this was seen as condoning it. And there was a prominent member of Philadelphia meeting who owned people and who wrote about what a good idea this was. And so there's some controversy about that too. But you know, what's interesting to me is why, here's this person, he's trained as a cobbler. He spent most of his time walking around, finding hollow trees, reading his Bible, going to churches and preaching about the importance of understanding your own relationship with God. You don't need anything else for your relationship with God. See, Martin Luther was saying you needed to have a Bible to have a relationship with God, but you didn't need a priest. And the priest was kind of helping you with, I'm not quite sure how that worked, but George Fox took it one step further. He said, you don't even need a priest for anything. You are your own priest, you know. And even the Bible isn't enough. You need to have direct relationship with God, is what he was saying. Yeah. So, So here he is then. This cobbler suddenly is an expert on arts. He's an expert on education. He's an expert on medicine because he's a healer. And he wrote some book called something about healing that Henry Cadbury reconstructed from his book. So this book, when he died, he had 13 people who were supposed to be his executors and make sure this book on miraculous healing was published, and it disappeared. They didn't much like this side of him. And then that was reconstructed by Henry Cadbury. And I found a very nice video, as I said before, by Michelle Tata, who talks about this miraculous healing. But it was interesting how people, you know, once it started becoming a movement, which it was, they were realizing George's deficiencies as well as his strengths. You know, you sort of take the good part and you build on that, and you just forget about the parts that don't work. So was he, I haven't even told you about James Naylor, but James Naylor was his chief rival for being the charismatic leader of this movement. James Naylor and George Fox did not get along, because they were both doing the same thing, which was telling people that they can take control of their own destiny, their own faith. And apparently George Naylor was an even more charismatic speaker than George Fox. And he was better at healing, whatever that means. And but he did something incredibly stupid. He gathered a whole lot of followers, and he reenacted Jesus going into Jerusalem on a donkey on Good Friday, with him sitting on the donkey like he was being Jesus. And he was accused of blasphemy, and he was arrested, and he had B branded on his forehead, and he had a nail hammered through his tongue. And he was, that sounds like enough torture, but it was even worse. He was put in a scaffold, he was in prison, and it totally broke him. And then he was going home to wherever he was, and he was robbed and beaten, and he died shortly after that. So he died in 1659, which was very early on. This is only 7 years after George's has his revelation, and long before, more than a decade before George did his triumphal America's tour. James Naylor, though, I mean, this is actually, James Naylor is interesting to me because I told you this before. My mother's family, your Pritchards, were Quakers in Ireland. And from what I've understood, James Naylor was the one that they were following. I don't know who the Pritchards were. I don't know whether they came from Wales or France. I really have very little understanding of who they were. But I know they showed up in Ireland around 1700, and they were linen makers. And in fact, my mother's family were linen makers right up until about 1920. Now all the linen is made in China. There's no linen really made in Ireland anymore. But that's what happened. You know, a whole community went over to Ireland, where they were not going to be persecuted as much as they were in England. So even though George Fox knew all these famous people and they kept getting him off things, for a regular person, being a Quaker was not a comfortable thing. And very likely that's why so many jumped on boats and came to Philadelphia and started the monthly meeting of the Friends of Philadelphia and all the other Quaker communities throughout the New World. Yeah, it's interesting because we're all connected one way or another. Okay, I think any questions? I will give you all my weekly newsletter. I'll put all the I'll put all my references in case you're interested in looking up part of this or more of it. I just find this whole story is absolutely astonishing. And I've told a very tiny fraction of it. So any questions that I will either try to answer or I will see if I can find something and get back to you on. That's interesting that Ellen's read No Cross and No Crown. I haven't, but I must. I'm reading through everything slowly but slowly.
Susanna, this was so wonderful. I can't even describe it. It is just marvelous. And as a lover of history and relearning Quakerism, it just could not be beat. You're really to be congratulated.
Thank you. Well, you know, I just told the story. They did it.
That's true.
Yeah. So anything controversial that I've said that, I mean, I'm not a historian. I mean, all I do is I read history, I read documentaries. I mean, as you know, my training is in science. But that was a long time ago. Yeah.
Susanna, could you
Yes,
talk a little bit about the early name for the society? I had thought that one of the names was Religious Society of the Friends of God.
Oh, really? Okay, that's interesting. Now, where did you find that? I can't say. Found it.
I read
okay,
the
let me
same
see if I
thing.
can find something. Okay.
Several places.
The Religious Society of the Friends of God. Well, that's close, isn't it? The Friends of Truth. Yes. But it's not the friends of each other. I just found that fascinating. Yeah. Getting back to the argument between James Naylor and George Fox, I mean, it was just awful what he did. George Fox visited him in prison, and I don't know, there was some kind of connection. He wanted to shake his hand or kiss him on the cheek or something, and George Fox gave him his foot to kiss. I mean, George Fox was a jerk. I mean, here's this very charismatic thing, but it's, of course, like everyone. I mean, we have our angels and our saints all at the same time. You know, I mean, but here's this person who was more like him than anyone else. And he, instead of supporting him in his time of trial, he's torturing him more. Now, I read that they had that they reconciled before James Naylor died, but I wonder if that's revisionist history. No, yeah.
Susanna, did you know if George Fox had a principal successor in the movement after he died?
That is interesting. No, but that's a very interesting question. So who took over?
I don't know.
That's very interesting. Well, of course. I mean, this was part of what he was saying. He was talking about a leaderless revolution of the spirit. So he didn't need a leader. I mean, everything he was doing was to try and not get himself killed or imprisoned. And then I guess other people were doing that too.
Well, did William Penn's movement in Pennsylvania become the principal site of, or the principal energy of growth of Quakerism after George Fox?
You know, but what's very interesting about that, and this is a very interesting book too, Friends in the Americas, is that Friends in the Americas did exactly what they wanted. So you had all these different streams. And that, of course, is the difference between being a Protestant and being the Roman Catholic Church, where everything happens in Rome, and you know, it's like a franchise. Quakers and Protestants were never like that, which is why there were so many sects opening up. And that's certainly true with the Quakers. There's so many different forms of Quaker thought, and so many different types of people who call themselves Quaker. I would, you know, the biggest number of Quakers in the world are in Kenya, but they are not recognizable for us. It's Pentecostal, it's ministers, it's the males in charge. You know, it's a very different form, and yet they call themselves Quakers. And I have also seen that too in various meetings around Philadelphia. Some Quaker meetings are very much spiritually based, and they're the ones that are doing well. Others are, it's essentially a tea club. You know, it's just it's a social group. And the ones that are social groups, they don't do as well, because when you're a social group and you know, and you don't like someone, they leave. There's no reason for them to stay. You know, I mean, it's, yeah, it's a much better way to keep things going, is if you have a spiritual basis for it, a faith base for it. You know, and following Jesus sounds like a good idea. But, you know, Jesus did the same thing too. It's interesting. I'm looking through all these people that started movements. I think there's a rule. If you want to start a movement, hang out with really wealthy people, and then the movement will happen. And which is why I think having the Friends School is a really important thing, because what you're doing is you're having a school for rich people. And Quakers as a group, anything as a group, cannot exist if it's just for poor people. That sounds elitist, but I don't think so. I mean, the thing is, though, that you have to, you know, you have to understand some people made a lot of money and they're very supportive of social groups, religious groups, and that's a good thing.
Roseanne or Susanna, did Quakerism remain strong in England after George Fox?
Yes, it did. And that's what's interesting is in the United States, we have all these yearly meetings. Britain has one yearly meeting and Ireland has one yearly meeting. That is it as strong as in the United States? No, there are fewer people. But I mean, you know, I've been to meetings in Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Oxford. So I've only been to 3 meetings. Oh, also online at Woodbrook. And you could be sitting in Arch Street at any of those meetings. They're all unprogrammed meetings. So is it strong? It's never been as strong as it was. I mean, we all know about the history of 1807 when in England it was made illegal to trade in humans. That stopped the slave trade in England. Then it was very big. I had an ancestor who I don't come from a very famous family, but every now and then I read something. It's like, oh my gosh, people had money in my family. And one thing that in my family that we owned was the priory on the Isle of Wight. And I know in the middle of the 1800s, this was rented out to Quaker meetings. So there were Quakers all over the place, and there were always Quakers in Parliament in England. There's a Cadbury who's a member of Parliament right now. Now in England too, Quakers were fries. You couldn't drink coffee and you couldn't drink alcohol and you couldn't drink tea. But what you could do is drink, well, tea everyone can drink. So cocoa was a big deal. And that started Cadbury and Fry's and Roundtree, these huge chocolate companies, but they also went into banking. And this is where banking and the slave trade ran across each other. Barclays Bank, Robert Barclay was a huge Quaker early on in the 1600s, and he wrote an apology for Quakers, which I've tried to read, and it's very difficult. So he wrote in Latin the basis for being a Quaker, and I understand this had a huge effect. Maybe I can talk about Robert Barclay some other time. But what's interesting about Robert Barclay is that, they started this huge bank, Barclays Bank, which is still very big in England now. But they made all their money on the slave trade, which is just shocking. So, I mean, it's interesting. In the early days of the slave trade, it's like, well, maybe they didn't see what was going on. I mean, it's hard to imagine that you wouldn't be appalled to see people in shackles being taken from one continent cruelly and taken to another continent with more than half the people dying on the way. I mean, it's hard to imagine how anyone wouldn't be shocked about if they knew that. But if you didn't know that, like, for example, with Bitcoin, I don't understand Bitcoin. Maybe it's really evil. Maybe it's really good. I don't know. So I can't take a stand against things I don't know about.
Well, to give everyone a foretaste, at the end of this year, I'm going to give a adult education talk on the New Jerseyan John Woolman, who the Quaker from Burlington County, who went around to meetings in this whole area and in particularly to speak to Quakers during the French and Indian War who owned slaves here in this Delaware Valley, to try to persuade them to stop owning slaves. And he spent a great deal of his life doing that, trying to persuade the Quaker slave owners to give up their slaves. And he was assisted in that by other Quakers who were trying to get rid of slave holding by Quakers. During that period, which was the 1750s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Oh. So at the end of this year, there you have it. Yeah. Some Quakers trying to abolish slavery in the 18th century.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we talk about and we know about things where we really fell down, and because people have this. I know you talk to people who don't know what Quakers are, and they think, oh yeah, they're pacifists, but we're just jerks like everyone else. Once in a while we have a good idea, but and we try. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, we just need to keep trying. Yeah. John Woolman, yeah, there's a lot of books about him in the PYM collection. There's a lot, and he wrote a lot too. So it's always helpful when people write a lot, because then you have their own words. Yeah. Well, Lois?
Hour's up.
Would you like me to end the meeting now, Susanna?
That sounds like a good idea. Thank you very much for this.
Okay, I'll do that and hope that it recorded. Somebody put it to the cloud, and I'm not sure how to get it back, but we will figure it out.
Well, I'll try to send it to you.
Super good. Thank you.
I'm technologically handicapped myself.
Well, we'll figure this out somehow. I'm going to hit the stop recording button,